March 1818. The grey stone walls of Marlow Castle in Devonshire absorbed what little spring sunlight dared penetrate the leaded windows, casting long shadows across floors that had witnessed 3 centuries of Ashford family history. In the servants' hall below stairs, a 19-year-old Catherine Eloise Whitley smoothed her plain grey work dress and tried to steady her trembling hands as Mrs. Beatrice Porter, the head housekeeper, delivered news that would alter the course of her unremarkable life forever. "You are to attend His Grace in his private chambers," Mrs. Porter said, her usually stern face softened by something that looked almost like pity. The other girls refused. They fear the consumption will take them too, or worse, that death itself haunts those rooms now. Servants talk of dark omens and curses, and of the Ashford line ending as it deserves. But fear makes people foolish. You have always been sensible, Catherine. You have shown courage in the 3 years you have been here, taking on tasks others shirked. The Duke needs someone now, someone who will not flinch from the reality of his condition, and I believe you have the fortitude for this. Catherine's heart thrummed against her ribs, not from fear of disease, but from the terrible awareness that she was about to enter the world of a man she had glimpsed only from great distances during her 3 years of service at Marlow Castle. She had seen him occasionally in the grand hallway, always surrounded by important visitors, always moving with purposeful strides that spoke of authority and burden. She had scrubbed the marble floors he walked upon, polished the banisters his hand had touched, cleaned the rooms where he conducted the business of running a duchy. But she had never spoken to him, never been addressed by him, never imagined she would be anything more than another invisible servant keeping the machinery of his household running smoothly. A man who was dying, the physicians had declared, with only months remaining before tuberculosis claimed him completely. "I understand, Mrs. Porter," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "When shall I begin?" "Within the hour. Gather your things from the dormitory. You will sleep in the small chamber adjacent to his rooms from now on, so you can attend him during the night, if needed. Dr. Edmund Graves visits every Tuesday and Friday to monitor his condition, and you will assist with those examinations. You will manage his meals, his medicines, his personal care, and anything else he requires. This is not an easy assignment, child. You will witness suffering, and you must remain composed throughout. Can you do that?" Catherine thought of her own father, dead these 5 years from a farming accident that had left him broken and bleeding in a field while she held his hand and watched the light fade from his eyes. She had been 14 then, barely more than a child herself, but she had not flinched or wept until after he was gone. She had learned early that tears were a luxury for private moments, not for times when someone needed you to be strong. "I can do that," she said firmly. The walk from the servants' quarters to the Duke's private chambers felt like crossing into another realm entirely. Catherine had scrubbed these very corridors countless times, her knees aching on cold stone, her hands raw from lye soap, but she had never ventured beyond the invisible boundary that separated the serving class from those they served. The servants' stairs gave way to the main corridors with their polished wood paneling and ancestral portraits. Now, her worn boots made soft sounds against imported carpets that cost more than her family's cottage in the village of Ashton. Portraits of stern-faced Ashford ancestors seemed to follow her progress with disapproving painted eyes. Dukes and duchesses from centuries past, all of them born to privilege, all of them certain of their place in the world. What would they think of a servant girl about to attend their dying descendant in his most vulnerable hours? Mrs. Porter paused before an ornately carved door depicting hunting scenes, its brass handle polished to mirror brightness. "Remember, child, His Grace may be dying, but he is still the Duke. Show proper deference at all times. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not meet his eyes unless he commands it. And above all, do not let sentiment cloud your duties. He needs care, not pity. He needs efficiency, not emotion. Can you remember that?" "Yes, Mrs. Porter." The housekeeper knocked twice, a precise rhythm that suggested protocol, and a weak male voice from within granted permission to enter. Catherine stepped into a room that smelled of medicinal herbs, beeswax candles, and something else she could not quite identify, but suspected was the scent of a body slowly surrendering to disease. The air itself felt heavy, as though illness had a weight that pressed down upon everything. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn back from the tall windows, allowing pale afternoon light to illuminate a vast chamber dominated by a four-poster bed carved from dark mahogany, its posts thick as tree trunks and decorated with more hunting scenes. And in that bed, propped against a mountain of pillows embroidered with the Ashford coat of arms, sat a man who looked nothing like the imposing figure she had expected. Tristan Leopold Ashford, Duke of Marlow, was 29 years old, though illness had carved years onto his features that should not yet have been there. His face was gaunt, the bones of his cheeks and jaw prominent beneath skin that had taken on an unhealthy pallor. His dark hair, slightly too long and falling past his collar, suggested he had been too ill to care about such niceties as regular barbering. But his eyes arrested her completely. They were the color of smoke over water, gray with hints of blue, and they held an intelligence and awareness that seemed entirely at odds with his weakened physical state. Those eyes studied her now with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see through her servant's uniform to the frightened girl beneath who had no idea how to navigate this impossible situation. "You must be Catherine," he said, his voice hoarse but surprisingly gentle, lacking the imperious tone she had expected from a duke. "Mrs. Porter mentioned you this morning when I inquired about the staff changes. She spoke highly of your competence and discretion. Thank you for agreeing to this rather grim assignment. I understand the other girls preferred to risk dismissal rather than attend a dying man. I cannot fault their reasoning. Death is not pleasant to witness, and I am told my particular form of dying will be especially unpleasant as the disease progresses." Catherine curtsied deeply, her mind racing with confusion. He was thanking her? Acknowledging her fear as reasonable rather than demanding she overcome it? Admitting his own condition with such stark honesty? This was not the interaction she had been taught to expect from nobility, who were supposed to maintain dignified distance from their servants at all times. "Your Grace, I am honored to serve in whatever capacity you require," she managed, keeping her eyes lowered as was proper, focusing on the intricate pattern of the carpet beneath her feet. "Look at me, please." His request was soft, but carried the weight of one accustomed to being obeyed. When she raised her eyes to his face, she found him studying her with an expression she could not decipher, something between curiosity and loneliness. "There, that is better. If you are to spend hours each day in this room, attending to tasks both mundane and unpleasant, I should prefer we dispense with the fiction that you are invisible. You have a name, a face, presumably thoughts of your own. I find I have little patience left for pretense. Death has a way of stripping away the nonsense we cloak ourselves in during life. You see, I am dying, Catherine. The physicians give me until September if I am fortunate, perhaps only until July if I am not. That leaves me approximately 6 months to make peace with mortality, and I have decided to spend those months in whatever honesty I can manage. In truth, my illness has stripped away my desire to adhere to class formality. So I ask you to do me the courtesy of being a person in my presence, not merely a servant playing a role." Over the following days, Catherine discovered that Tristan Leopold Ashford was unlike any man she had ever encountered, titled or otherwise. He did not treat her as a piece of furniture that happened to move and fetch things. When she brought his morning tea at precisely 6 o'clock, he asked her about her family in Ashton, listening with genuine interest as she described her mother's remarriage and her younger brother's apprenticeship to the village blacksmith. When she read aloud from the newspaper while he was too weak to hold it himself, he solicited her opinions on the political matters described, seeming genuinely curious about what a servant girl thought of parliamentary debates about corn laws and factory conditions. when she helped him walk the short distance from bed to chair by the window, supporting his weight with difficulty given his height and her smaller frame, he apologized for leaning so heavily on her, as though she were doing him a personal favor rather than performing the duty she was paid for. "My father was a tenant farmer on the Waverley estate," she told him one afternoon in late March, emboldened by his genuine interest and the way he actually remembered details from their previous conversations. He worked Lord Waverley's land for 30 years, paying rent that increased every year while the quality of the soil decreased from overuse. He died when I was 14, kicked by a horse, and died 3 days later from internal bleeding. My mother remarried within the year to Samuel Winters, the village blacksmith. He is a good man, kind enough to my mother, but there was not enough room or resources for me in their cottage, not with his own 3 children from his first marriage already crowding the space. So I came here. Mrs. Porter was kind enough to take me on despite my youth and lack of experience. I have been here 5 years now, worked my way up from scullery maid to general housemaid, and now this. Tristan, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown of burgundy silk, despite the fire burning vigorously in the grate, gazed out at the rolling Devonshire hills visible from his window. Spring was transforming the landscape, bringing green to the fields and blossoms to the trees, life renewing itself in stark contrast to the decay happening within his body. "You must have been frightened, so young and alone in a place like this. Marlow Castle is not known for being welcoming to new servants. The hierarchy below stairs can be as rigid and unforgiving as the hierarchy above." "I was terrified," Catherine admitted, surprised at her own honesty, but somehow unable to maintain the usual barriers between servant and master when he spoke to her with such directness. "But Mrs. Porter took me under her protection and taught me that fear could be transformed into competence through hard work. She said fear was just energy without direction, and if I could direct that energy into learning my duties perfectly, I would survive. And the work gave me purpose. I discovered I was good at anticipating needs, at seeing what required attention before being told. These halls are more familiar to me now than my childhood home ever was. I know which floorboards creak, which windows let in drafts, which rooms are warmest in winter and coolest in summer. I know the rhythms of this place as though they were written in my bones, and perhaps I know them better than those who merely inhabit them." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken, in a way she did not understand and knew better than to examine. 5 years of scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots for people who likely never learned your name. That seems a waste of a curious mind. You have opinions about corn laws and factory conditions. You observe details others miss. You speak well despite limited formal education. Those qualities suggest potential for far more than domestic service, yet here you are, trapped by the circumstances of your birth as surely as I am trapped by mine. It is the lot I was given, Your Grace. I do not complain. Many have far worse circumstances. At least I have shelter, regular meals, and work that keeps me occupied. There are girls in Ashton who have none of those things. Perhaps you should complain, he said quietly, a note of something like anger entering his voice, though she sensed it was not directed at her. I spent a decade performing my duties as Duke, with perfect adherence to expectation. Yet what did that perfect performance yield me? This wasting disease, and the realization that I connected with no one meaningfully in all those years. I attended every session of Parliament required of my position, voted as family tradition dictated, managed these estates with precision that would have made my father proud, married off my sisters to advantageous matches they claimed to desire, and never once asked myself if any of it brought me joy or purpose beyond maintaining the status quo. Now I have 6 months, possibly less, and I find myself wondering what I might have done differently had I possessed the courage to question the life laid out for me before I could walk. I might have traveled beyond the grand tour expected of young nobles. I might have pursued interests that held genuine fascination rather than appropriate hobbies. I might have spoken to people like you years ago and discovered that wisdom and intelligence are not the exclusive province of those born with titles. Catherine did not know how to respond to such raw vulnerability from a man of his station. She busied herself adjusting the pillows behind his back, fluffing them and rearranging them to better support his increasingly fragile frame, aware of how close she stood to him, of the warmth of his body through the layers of fabric, of the way his breath caught slightly when she leaned near. She could smell the soap he had been washed with that morning, lavender and something else, and beneath that, the faint medicinal scent of the tonics Dr. Graves prescribed. "I think, Your Grace, that we are perhaps not so different," she finally said, the words emerging before she could consider whether speaking them was wise. "You were trapped by duty and title and the expectations of your class. I am trapped by birth and circumstance and the limitations society places on people like me. The prison walls may look different, constructed of different materials and painted in different colors, but they confine us equally. Neither of us chose our positions. Neither of us can easily escape them, and both of us are learning, perhaps too late, that the structures we thought were permanent and unchangeable are actually rather arbitrary when examined honestly." He laughed then, a sound that started genuine and warm but turned into a coughing fit that left him gasping and wiping blood from his lips with a linen handkerchief that was already stained with previous episodes. Catherine fetched water from the pitcher on the bedside table and held the cup to his mouth with steady hands, waiting patiently for the spasm to pass, counting his breaths and noting the increased wetness in his lungs that suggested the disease was progressing exactly as Dr. Graves had predicted. When his breathing calmed to something approximating normal, though still labored compared to a healthy person, he took her hand in his, an action so unexpected that she nearly pulled away out of sheer habit and propriety. "Thank you, Catherine, not just for the water, for speaking truth to me, for treating me like a person rather than a title or a collection of duties. I find it remarkably refreshing to have conversations that do not involve carefully worded condolences or awkward attempts to pretend my mortality is not the dominant reality in this room. You acknowledge it without flinching, and that honesty is a gift I did not know I needed." As March gave way to April, something shifted in the atmosphere of those private chambers that Catherine could not quite name but felt with increasing intensity. The days established a rhythm of care that brought them into close and constant contact. She would arrive at dawn to help him wash and dress, an intimate process that required touching him in ways that made her acutely aware of the boundaries she was crossing, the propriety she was violating, even though it was all in service of necessary care. She would bring his breakfast and watch him struggle to eat, his appetite diminished by disease and medication, and would coax him to take a few more bites the way one might coax a stubborn child. She would read to him when he lacked the strength to read for himself, and gradually their reading evolved from newspapers to the books that lined the shelves of his personal library. Tristan grew weaker in body, but seemed to come alive intellectually during their conversations. He had an extensive library moved to his room, volumes on philosophy, history, poetry, science, and novels that were considered perhaps not quite appropriate for a young unmarried woman to read, though he dismissed such concerns with a wave of his hand. Catherine found herself reading aloud, not just for his entertainment, but for her own education, absorbing ideas and arguments she had never encountered in her limited schooling. And they debated those ideas, her initial shyness giving way to passionate arguments when she disagreed with his interpretations or found logical flaws in the philosopher's reasoning. "You cannot possibly believe that Rousseau's social contract applies to our English society," she said one morning in mid-April, lowering the volume of political philosophy she had been reading. The rain outside created a steady rhythm against the windows, the weather matching her combative mood. "Surely, Your Grace, the contract requires all parties to have entered it willingly, with full knowledge and consent. But I was born into servitude just as you were born into nobility. We had no choice in the matter, no negotiation, no opportunity to review the terms and decide if they suited us. How then can it be a legitimate contract when half the population never agreed to its terms and gains nothing from its existence except the privilege of serving the other half?" Tristan's eyes sparked with delight at her challenge, his face more animated than she had seen it in days. An excellent point that strikes at the heart of social contract theory. So you would argue we need fundamental restructuring of society itself to achieve any true social contract? That the entire edifice is built on faulty foundations? I argue nothing, Your Grace. I merely observe that the philosophers write from positions of privilege and seem to forget that most of humanity has no voice in these grand theories. They speak of natural rights and consent of the governed, but somehow those principles never extend to women, servants, laborers, or anyone else who actually does the work that keeps society functioning. The social contract seems to apply only to men of property, which makes it rather less universal than Rousseau claims. Catherine Eloise Whitley, you are a dangerous radical, he said, but his tone was warm, almost proud, as though he had discovered something valuable. Had you been born male and to a family of means, you would be causing considerable trouble in Parliament, proposing reforms that would make the old guard apoplectic. You have the kind of mind that sees through accepted wisdom to the contradictions beneath. Had I been born male and to a family of means, I would likely be exactly like every other lord, blind to my own privilege and perfectly content with a system that benefited me, she countered, then immediately clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified at her own boldness. She had essentially insulted him and his entire class in the process of making her point. But Tristan only laughed, that beautiful sound that still ended in coughing, but which he produced more frequently in her presence. You are probably right. I was certainly blind for 29 years. It took dying to finally open my eyes, and I find I rather resent the timing. I would have liked more time to live with this new awareness, to perhaps do something useful with it, rather than merely recognizing my failures as I exit the stage. By mid-April, the nature of Catherine's duties had expanded beyond the physical care of a patient into something that resembled genuine companionship. Tristan asked her to call him by his given name when they were alone, a request that scandalized and thrilled her in equal measure. She refused, of course, because such familiarity could mean her immediate dismissal if discovered, would be seen as proof of improper relations between them, even though nothing inappropriate had occurred. But the fact that he had asked revealed a shifting dynamic that both excited and terrified her, a blurring of the boundaries that society insisted must remain clear and impassable between people of their different stations. She began to notice small things about him that had nothing to do with his illness and everything to do with him as a person. The way his hair fell across his forehead when he became animated during their debates, requiring him to push it back with long fingers that trembled slightly from weakness. The precise shape of his hands, elegant despite the thinness that came from muscle wasting, the way he gestured when making a point as though conducting an invisible orchestra, the dimple that appeared in his left cheek when he smiled genuinely, which he seemed to do only for her, never for the physicians or the other servants who occasionally entered his chambers. The way his gray-blue eyes followed her movements around the room with an intensity that made her skin warm and her breath catch, as though he were memorizing her through pure observation. And she became horrifyingly aware of her own physical response to his presence, sensations she had no experience with and no framework for understanding. Her heart would race when she entered his chambers each morning, anticipation mixing with concern about what state she would find him in. Her hands trembled when she helped him dress, the innocent intimacy of buttoning his shirt or tying his cravat suddenly feeling charged with unspoken tension that made her fingers clumsy. She dreamed of him at night, in ways that made her wake with her face burning and her body aching with sensations she had no right to feel for a dying duke. Dreams where his hands touched her, and his mouth spoke words that had nothing to do with philosophy or politics. The servants' gossip reached her ears through the kitchen maids who resented her elevated position and the special treatment she received by virtue of her assignment. She thinks herself special now, spending all day in his chambers behind a closed door. Wonder what really goes on up there. A dying man might want one last taste of pleasure before death claims him, and who would stop him taking it from a nobody like her? Not like she could refuse the Duke, not if she wants to keep her position. And not like he has to worry about consequences, does he? He will be dead before any scandal comes to light. Catherine clamped down on the whispers, knowing that nothing improper had occurred, that Tristan treated her with more genuine respect than any man ever had, seeing her intelligence and humanity rather than just a body to be used. But the words planted seeds of doubt that grew in the darkness of her room at night. Was she fooling herself about the nature of their connection? Did he see her as a person, or merely as a convenient distraction during his final months, someone safe to confide in because she did not matter enough to judge him or spread tales in social circles he cared about? The answer came in late April, during an afternoon that had started unremarkably. Tristan was having one of his better days, strong enough to sit in the chair by the window without needing constant support, and Catherine was mending one of his shirts that had torn at the seam from the weight loss that made his clothes hang loose on his frame. They were discussing a recent letter he had received from his sister Arabella, now married and living in Bath, when he suddenly fell silent mid-sentence, the words dying on his lips. She looked up from her needlework to find him staring at her with an expression of such raw longing that her needle slipped and pricked her finger. A drop of blood welled up, crimson against her pale skin, and she watched it with strange fascination for a moment, before reaching for her handkerchief. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. "I need to tell you something, though I have no right to burden you with it, and even less right to expect anything in return. These past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Not despite my illness, but somehow because of it. Because this disease stripped away all pretense and all the social masks I wore for decades and left me capable of recognizing what matters. You matter. Your thoughts, your laughter, your presence, the way you challenge me and surprise me and make me feel alive even as I die. I have fallen in love with you, completely and irrevocably, in a way I never experienced in my previous 29 years of existence." The confession settled between them, heavy and undeniable, impossible to ignore once uttered. Catherine's heart jolted so violently she thought it might escape her chest entirely, and her breath came in short gasps that she struggled to control. "You cannot mean that," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain against the windows. "I am a servant. You are the Duke of Marlow. Such feelings are not possible between us. Society does not permit it. The natural order does not permit it. You are speaking from illness and isolation, not genuine emotion." And yet, the feelings exist," Tristan said simply, his gaze never leaving her face. "I do not expect you to return them. I do not even expect you to believe me. You may think I am addled by fever or desperate from loneliness. But I could not continue without speaking the truth aloud at least once. I have lived 29 years saying what was expected, doing what was proper, performing the role assigned to me at birth with perfect adherence to script, and now I have months at most. I will not waste them on more lies, even polite ones that make social interaction smoother. I love you, Catherine Eloise Whitley. You have made my dying tolerable by giving me something to live for in my final months." Catherine set down the mending with shaking hands that could no longer grip the needle properly. Every rational thought screamed at her to deny his words, to maintain the proper distance, to protect herself from the heartbreak that could only come from loving a dying man so far above her station that they might as well exist in different worlds. But something deeper and more honest than rationality rose up to silence those careful thoughts. "I love you too," she said, the words emerging like a confession torn from her soul, painful and liberating in equal measure. "I have loved you for weeks now, though I tried desperately not to. I tried to see you only as my patient, my duty, the Duke I was assigned to care for. But you made that impossible. You spoke to me as though my thoughts had value beyond their utility. You listened when I spoke as though my words mattered for their content rather than their subservience. You saw me, truly saw me as a person with intelligence and opinions and worth, and I have never been seen before in my entire life. So yes, I love you, though it will break my heart and possibly ruin my life. I love you, and I am not sorry for it, even knowing how this must end." Tristan rose from his chair with effort, his body protesting the movement, and Catherine rushed to his side to support him, slipping her arm around his waist to take some of his weight. But instead of allowing her to guide him back to bed as she intended, he took both her hands in his and held them gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that sent shivers through her entire body. "I want to kiss you," he said, the words both request and warning. "I have wanted to for weeks, probably longer. May I? I will not command it, will not use my position to coerce you. This must be your choice, freely given, or not at all." The question itself was radical, revolutionary even. He was asking permission when he could simply have taken what he wanted with no consequences beyond perhaps her dismissal, which would matter nothing to a dying man. The asking made her love him even more fiercely, made her want to give him everything she had to offer. "Yes," she breathed, the word barely audible but sufficient. His kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of a man who had not done this in years and who was acutely aware of his own weakness and her inexperience. His lips were warm and soft against hers, tasting faintly of the mint tea he had drunk earlier, and beneath that, something indefinably him. Catherine had never been kissed before, had never imagined her first kiss would be with the Duke in his private chambers, while rain drummed against windows, and her entire world shifted on its axis. She leaned into him carefully, mindful of his fragility, and felt his arms come around her waist to pull her closer, his hands splayed across her back in a way that made her feel both protected and desired. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, though his breaths came with that wet rattle that reminded her sharply of his condition and the limited time they had. "I have done you a terrible disservice," Tristan said, resting his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as though in pain. His voice cracked, revealing the extent of his despair. "I have made you love a man who will be dead before summer's end. I am selfish and cruel, and you should rightfully hate me for placing you in this impossible position." "Hush," Catherine said, reaching up to stroke his too thin cheek with fingers that trembled from emotion rather than fear. "I would rather have these months with you, knowing how they will end, than a lifetime of safety without ever having known this feeling. You have given me something precious beyond measure. Do not apologize for it. Do not diminish it by calling it a disservice. This is the greatest gift I have ever received, and I will treasure it regardless of the pain that must come." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the fading April light, both aware that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return and from which society would judge them harshly if discovered. The secret of their love affair, conducted entirely within the confines of his chambers where no one else could witness, sustained them through May as Tristan's health continued its inevitable decline despite the joy their connection brought him. They stole kisses between readings, held hands beneath the blankets when she adjusted his pillows, whispered endearments in the early morning hours when the rest of the castle still slept and she would arrive in his chambers before the other servants stirred to begin their duties. He told her about his childhood, about the pressures of being raised to inherit a duchy, about his mother who had died when he was 8, and his father who had ruled the estate with iron discipline until his death 5 years prior. She told him about growing up in poverty, about watching her father struggle with impossible rents, about her fear of ending up alone and destitute when she was too old to work. But reality intruded brutally in the first week of June when Tristan's cousin Vincent arrived from London, summoned by the family solicitor who believed certain legal matters required immediate attention given the Duke's deteriorating condition and the lack of any heir to continue the direct bloodline. Vincent Ashford was everything his cousin was not in temperament and character. Where Tristan was thoughtful and gentle, Vincent was ambitious and calculating. Where Tristan treated servants with respect, Vincent barely acknowledged their existence except to issue curt commands. He was 32 years old, handsome in a cold fashion that suggested cruelty beneath the polished exterior, impeccably dressed in the latest London fashion, and as the Duke's nearest male relative, stood to inherit everything if Tristan died without legitimate issue, a prospect that seemed increasingly certain. Catherine first encountered him in the corridor outside the Duke's chambers on the afternoon of his arrival, where he was in heated discussion with Mr. Harold Whitmore, the family solicitor who managed the estate's legal affairs, and Dr. Edmund Graves, the physician who visited weekly to chart Tristan's decline and adjust his medications accordingly. "The situation is untenable," Vincent was saying, his voice pitched to carry and infused with the impatience of someone accustomed to having his opinions heard and acted upon. "A duchy of this size and importance cannot pass to a cousin when a direct line might yet be established through legitimate means. Surely there must be women of appropriate discretion willing to perform this service for appropriate financial compensation. We need not look to the aristocracy for such a purpose. A woman of lower birth, someone who understands her place and can be trusted to remain silent after the fact, would serve perfectly well." "You speak of producing an heir as though it were a business transaction," Dr. Graves said with clear disapproval, his elderly face creased with distaste. "His Grace is dying, not conducting estate management." "It is a business transaction," Vincent snapped, his handsome face hardening into something ugly. "The only question is whether my dear cousin can be persuaded to see reason before it is too late for action. The medical men give him until September at most, possibly August given his rate of decline. That leaves 4 months to conceive a child, which is cutting it remarkably close even under the best circumstances. We should have begun this process months ago when he first took ill, but he refused to discuss it then and continues to refuse now. His stubbornness will cost the estate dearly." Catherine felt ice water flood her veins as she realized with horrible clarity what they were discussing. They wanted Tristan to father a child quickly, with any available woman of appropriately low status, purely to prevent Vincent from inheriting and to preserve the direct bloodline. The cold calculation of it, the reduction of something that should be beautiful and meaningful to a mere matter of property law and inheritance, made her feel physically ill. She thought of Tristan's gentle nature, his respect for her autonomy, his insistence that everything between them be freely chosen, and knew with absolute certainty that he would have rejected their scheme with the same disgust she felt. She slipped past them unnoticed, her servant's invisibility serving her well in that moment, and entered the Duke's chambers to find him sitting at his writing desk, his hand trembling badly as he attempted to sign correspondence that required his attention. He looked up at her entrance, and his face immediately softened in the way it only did for her, years of noble composure melting away to reveal genuine affection. "My love," he said, then caught himself with a grimace of worry. "Forgive me. I should not call you that where others might hear, even through closed doors. The risk to your reputation is too great. My reputation, Your Grace, pales beside the truth of this room and my love for you," Catherine said fiercely, crossing to him and kneeling beside his chair so she could look up into his face. "I just encountered your cousin Vincent in the corridor with the solicitor and Dr. Graves. He was discussing with great urgency the need for you to produce an heir before you die, as though you were a breeding stallion whose only remaining value lies in your bloodline rather than a human being deserving of dignity in your final months." Tristan's expression darkened, anger flashing in his gray-blue eyes. "He and Mr. Whitmore have been pressuring me for weeks through letters and messages. They even had the audacity during their last visit to suggest I select a woman from the village, someone poor enough to be controlled with money and threats, to carry a child, and then disappear after its birth. They mentioned your name specifically, actually, said you were appropriately loyal and biddable, proven to be discreet, already in close contact with me, which would make the arrangement simpler. They spoke of you as though you were livestock to be bred according to the estate's convenience." Catherine stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, rage burning through her that they would speak of her that way, would reduce her to a vessel for producing an heir as casually as they might discuss purchasing a mare for breeding purposes. "They spoke of me?" To you? Suggested that I could be used in such a manner? I threw them physically out of this room when they suggested it, Tristan said, reaching for her hand and pulling her back down beside him, his grip weak but insistent. I told them you were worth 1,000 of their scheming, self-serving machinations, that you had more inherent nobility in your smallest finger than Vincent possessed in his entire being, and that I would rather see the duchy pass to my worthless cousin than use you so callously. They were not pleased with my response. Vincent accused me of allowing sentiment to cloud my judgment. Mr. Whitmore suggested I was being selfish by refusing to think of the estate's future. Neither seemed capable of understanding that some things matter more than property and inheritance. Catherine's mind raced, sorting through tangled emotions and impossible possibilities that she had not allowed herself to consider before this moment. She loved this man with an intensity that terrified her, loved him so completely that the thought of existing in a world he did not inhabit felt impossible to contemplate. And she knew their time together was measured in months at most, perhaps only weeks if his decline accelerated. The thought of Tristan dying without leaving something of himself behind, without the world holding tangible evidence that he had existed and mattered and was worthy of remembrance, was unbearable. And beneath that noble thought lurked something more primal and undeniable, the desire to be connected to him in the most fundamental way possible, to create life with him even as his own life slipped inexorably away, to have a child who would carry his features and perhaps his gentle nature. "What if I agreed?" she said quietly, the words emerging before she could fully consider their implications. Tristan's head snapped around, his eyes wide with shock. "Catherine, no. Absolutely not. I will not allow you to be used that way, to sacrifice your innocence and your future for the benefit of scheming men who care nothing for you beyond your utility. That is not why I would do it," she said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I would not do it for Vincent, or the solicitor, or the duchy, or the Ashford legacy. I would do it for you, because I love you more than I thought it possible to love another person, and because the thought of you leaving nothing behind except property and titles breaks my heart. And I would do it for myself, selfishly, because I want a piece of you to remain with me after you are gone. I want to carry something of you forward into whatever life awaits me in your absence." "Catherine," he breathed, his voice breaking with emotion, "you do not understand what you are suggesting or the consequences you would face. If you bore my child out of wedlock, even if acknowledged as mine, you would be ruined in society's eyes. No respectable man would ever marry you. You would be dependent on the charity of my estate forever, subject to Vincent's whims and cruelty once I am gone. Your child would be forever marked as illegitimate, denied the titles and respect that should be their birthright. I cannot ask that of you." "Then marry me," she said recklessly, the idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "Not a grand society wedding in London with hundreds of witnesses. I understand that is impossible given your condition and our difference in station. But there are ways, are there not? Legal ceremonies that could be performed quietly with minimal witnesses? I have heard of such things, morganatic marriages, where the lower-born spouse does not assume all titles, but the children are legitimate. Marry me, Tristan. Make me your wife in the eyes of God and law, even if society never acknowledges it. Give our child legitimacy and me the protection of your name." Tristan stared at her as though she had suggested they fly to the moon or turn back time itself. "You want to marry a dying man? To become a widow before you are 20 years old? To tie yourself legally to someone who can offer you months at most, who will leave you to navigate widowhood and motherhood alone in a world that will judge you harshly for this choice?" "Yes," Catherine said simply, with a certainty that came from her very core. "I want exactly that. I want to be your wife, even if only briefly. I want whatever time we can have to be real and legal and ours. Not their scheme for producing an heir, but our choice to create something beautiful from whatever time remains. I want to wake up every morning as your wife until the morning when I wake as your widow, and I will treasure every moment between." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her with a desperation that spoke of his own longing warring with his conscience and his awareness of what he was asking her to accept. He leaned his full weight against her, a silent admission of his failure and the sorrow of his approaching end. "You deserve so much more than I can give you. A young, healthy husband who will grow old alongside you. Children raised in security with both parents present. A long life filled with normal joys and simple happiness." "I do not want normal joys or simple happiness," Catherine said fiercely against his chest, breathing in the scent of him that had become as familiar as her own. "I want extraordinary ones, even if they come at a terrible cost. I want you, Tristan Leopold Ashford, for however long fate and fortune allow. I would rather have 6 months as your wife than 60 years as anyone else's. A lifetime of safety would be a lifetime of emotional emptiness compared to this truth." The next 3 days passed in a blur of secret arrangements conducted with the help of Mrs. Porter, who proved an unexpected and invaluable ally in their plans. When informed of Catherine's decision, the elderly housekeeper wept openly, and then gathered the girl into her arms with a fierceness that spoke of genuine maternal affection. "You have the bravest, most foolish heart I have ever encountered in 40 years of service," Mrs. Porter said, holding Catherine tightly. "But if this is truly your choice, made freely with full understanding of the consequences, then I will help you however I can. His Grace is a good man, perhaps the best man this family has produced in generations, and you have brought him more genuine happiness in these few months than I have seen him display in all the years I have served him. You have given him something to live for beyond duty. That is no small gift." The marriage took place in Marlow Castle's small private chapel on June 10th, 1818, a grey morning with rain threatening in the clouds that hung low over the Devonshire hills. The ceremony was witnessed only by Mrs. Porter, Mr. Whitmore, the reluctantly compliant solicitor who had been compelled to participate by Tristan's direct order and threats of immediate dismissal, and Vincent Ashford, whose presence was legally required as the Duke's nearest relative, and whose fury radiated from him in palpable waves throughout the brief ceremony. The marriage was morganatic, as Catherine had suggested, an unusual arrangement typically used when royalty married commoners, but available under English law for peers of sufficient rank. It meant Catherine would not technically hold the title of Duchess during Tristan's lifetime and would not be received in society as such, though any children born of the union would be legally legitimate and capable of inheriting titles and property. However, Mr. B. Whitmore was forced to concede it satisfied the legal requirements to establish a legitimate bloodline while protecting Tristan from accusations of having completely abandoned his duties to his class. Catherine wore a simple white dress borrowed from Mrs. Porter's own wedding 40 years prior, altered to fit her smaller frame and adorned with lace that the housekeeper had carefully preserved all these decades. Wildflowers from the castle gardens, gathered early that morning by sympathetic servants who had come to respect the girl who treated them with kindness, were woven into her dark hair. Tristan was dressed in his finest coat and waistcoat, though they hung loosely on his wasted frame, and he trembled with exhaustion through the ceremony, despite having rested all the previous day in preparation. But his eyes never left Catherine's face, and when the minister pronounced them man and wife according to the laws of England and the grace of God, his kiss was tender and full of promises neither of them could be sure he would live to keep. Vincent departed immediately after the ceremony, without offering congratulations or acknowledging Catherine in any way, his parting words to Tristan dripping with barely controlled venom. "You have married a nobody servant and produced no heir yet to justify this farce. Do not imagine this changes anything of substance, cousin. She will be a pretty young widow with empty coffers and no social standing when you are gone, and I will personally ensure she understands exactly what her place is in the order of things. No amount of legal maneuvering will make her your equal or worthy of the Ashford name." That night, in the privacy of chambers that were now legally shared between husband and wife, Tristan and Catherine consummated their marriage with a gentleness and care born of genuine love and acute awareness of his fragility. He apologized repeatedly for his weakness, for the trembling in his limbs that made even simple movements difficult, for the way he had to pause frequently to catch his breath and control the coughing that threatened to overcome him. But Catherine silenced his apologies with kisses and whispered reassurances, showing him without words that his worth to her had nothing to do with physical prowess or performance and everything to do with the person he was in his essence. Afterwards, lying in his arms in the massive four-poster bed that had belonged to generations of Ashford dukes, Catherine traced patterns on his chest where she could feel his heart beating steadily beneath her palm, and marveled at the impossible turn her life had taken. 3 months ago, she had been a nobody servant, expecting nothing more than years of hard work, eventual marriage to some village boy if she was fortunate, and a life lived entirely within the narrow confines society permitted women of her class. Now, she was the wife of a duke, legally if not socially, and she carried within her body the possibility of his heir and the continuation of a bloodline stretching back centuries. "I hope we made a child tonight," Tristan murmured into her hair, his voice drowsy with exhaustion and contentment. "I know I have no time left, yet I yearn to leave you with something more than money and legal protections. I want to leave you with a piece of myself that will grow and live, and perhaps carry forward whatever good qualities I might possess. A child who will know they came from love, not duty or arrangement." "You are leaving me with everything that matters," Catherine said, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "You taught me that I had worth beyond my station and circumstances. You showed me that love could exist between two people, regardless of the barriers society erects between them. You gave me confidence I never possessed and dreams I never dared to dream. Whatever happens now, however short or long our time together, you have given me more than I ever imagined asking for." June and July passed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing subtle evidence of Tristan's continued decline that no amount of medical intervention could halt or reverse. His appetite diminished further until Catherine struggled to get him to eat more than a few bites at each meal. He could no longer make the walk from bed to chair without her assistance and that of a footman. The wet rattle in his chest grew louder and more constant, and blood appeared more frequently on the handkerchiefs he kept always within reach. Dr. Graves made his pronouncements with increasing grimness, suggesting the Duke had perhaps until early autumn at best, possibly only weeks if infection took hold in his weakened lungs. But Tristan also displayed a stubborn determination that surprised everyone who knew him. When Catherine confirmed in early August that she was indeed with child, having missed 2 monthly courses and experiencing the morning sickness that Dr. Graves confirmed as a sign of pregnancy, something shifted dramatically in Tristan's demeanor and his will to survive. He began eating more deliberately, forcing down food he had no appetite for because he understood his body needed sustenance if he was to have any hope of meeting his child. He insisted on receiving daily updates about estate management, suddenly concerned with ensuring his affairs were properly arranged and that Catherine would have advocates and allies after his death. He dictated letters to his sisters and other relatives he maintained cordial relationships with, making certain they understood Catherine's position and asking them to offer her guidance and protection in the difficult months ahead. "You will want for nothing," he told her one afternoon in late August, as she sat beside his bed with her hand resting on the small but unmistakable swell of her abdomen that marked the presence of new life. "I have settled a substantial jointure on you, far more than Vincent can reasonably contest, even with the best solicitors London can provide. You will have an income that allows you to live comfortably, either here at Marlow if you can bear to remain, or wherever you choose to make your home. Our child will be raised knowing their father loved them desperately, even if I cannot be present to demonstrate it in person through years of guidance and affection. Stop talking about your death as though it is a certainty arriving next week," Catherine said, though she knew it was denial speaking rather than reason. "You are still here. We are still together. Your hand is in mine, and I can feel your pulse and hear your voice. Let us focus on that rather than what is to come." The castle, which had felt like a tomb back in March when Catherine first entered Tristan's chambers, began to come alive again that summer, despite the shadow of impending death that hung over its master. Catherine, with Mrs. Porter's guidance and support, began making small but significant changes to the running of the household. The below-stairs staff reaction was varied. While those whose wages she increased offered fierce loyalty, others who resented her swift elevation watched her movements with keen scrutiny and thinly veiled envy. She improved conditions for the servants, increasing wages where the estate could afford it, and ensuring better meals were provided to those who worked the hardest. She opened dialogue with tenant farmers, listening to their concerns about rents and crop failures, and implementing practical solutions that improved productivity without increasing their burdens. Word spread through the village of Ashton that the Duke's wife, common-born though she was, had a good heart and a practical mind that understood the realities of working people's lives. When Tristan was strong enough to focus, Catherine would read him the letters of gratitude she received from families in Ashton and across the estate whose circumstances had improved because of her interventions. His pride in her accomplishments was evident in every glance, every word of praise, every smile that transformed his gaunt face into something approaching the handsome man he had been before illness ravaged him. "You are going to be a remarkable Duchess in all the ways that matter," he said one afternoon while she read him a letter from a widow whose cottage roof Catherine had ordered repaired before winter. Not in title, perhaps, not in society's eyes, but in every way that actually affects people's lives. These people will remember you long after they have forgotten me and my parliamentary votes and estate management. You are making a real difference, Catherine. Never doubt that. They will remember you as the Duke who married the servant girl and loved her enough to change the world for her, Catherine countered, setting the letter aside to take his hand. They will remember you as the nobleman who saw beyond class and privilege to recognize common humanity. That is no small legacy, my love. Autumn arrived with golden light, painting the Devonshire hills, and a crispness in the air that made the castle's ancient stone walls seem colder, despite the fires burning in every grate. Tristan's condition had stabilized to a degree that genuinely surprised Dr. Graves, who admitted privately to Mrs. Porter that he had expected the Duke to perish by September's end and could not explain in medical terms why he continued to live. The pregnancy, now visibly evident and progressing normally according to the physician's examinations, seemed to be acting as a tether to life, giving Tristan a concrete reason to fight against the disease consuming him from within. But fighting and winning were not the same thing, and everyone knew it. By October, Tristan was confined entirely to bed, his breathing labored even at rest, his body little more than skin stretched painfully over bones that seemed too prominent. He could no longer sit up without assistance or hold a book without dropping it. Catherine spent every possible moment at his side, reading to him, talking to him about estate business and preparations for the baby, simply holding his hand and reminding him through her presence that he was loved and valued beyond all measure. Vincent made periodic visits from his own property, always accompanied by the solicitor, always with the barely concealed hope that this would finally be the time he heard news of his cousin's death and could begin asserting his claim to whatever portions of the estate were not protected for the child. He had begun making plans for his tenure as Duke, discussing renovations to the castle and changes to estate management with anyone who would listen, treating it as inevitable despite the fact that Tristan's child would inherit and Vincent would serve at most as temporary guardian if the child was still a minor. His disregard for Catherine bordered on open hostility, though he was careful never to insult her directly in Tristan's hearing for fear of being banned from the property entirely. On a November morning when frost painted elaborate patterns on the windows and the fire in Tristan's chambers struggled against the cold, seeping through ancient stones, Catherine's labor began 3 weeks earlier than Dr. Graves had predicted. The pains started as mild discomfort that she initially dismissed as the normal aches of late pregnancy. but within hours they had intensified to the point where she could no longer hide her distress. Mrs. Porter immediately took charge, summoning Dr. Graves urgently from the village, along with Martha Blackwell, an experienced midwife who had attended half the births in Ashton for the past 30 years and whose competence was legendary. Tristan, weak as he was and barely conscious most days now, somehow sensed something significant was happening. He insisted through gestures and broken words on being informed of every development in Catherine's labor. Mrs. Porter, understanding that he needed this connection even if he could not be physically present, shuttled between the birthing chamber where Catherine labored and the Duke's chambers where he waited with barely contained anxiety, his own breathing growing more labored with each passing hour as though he too were engaged in the monumental struggle to bring forth new life. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the entire day and into the darkest hours of night. Catherine, exhausted and frightened by the intensity of pain she had not truly comprehended despite Martha's preparations, called for Tristan repeatedly, wanting him present even though she knew it was improper and potentially dangerous given his condition. Mrs. Porter gently explained multiple times that men did not attend births, that it was not proper according to any standard of society, that his fragile health made it unsafe for him to be exposed to the chaos and fluids of childbirth. But propriety had long since ceased to govern their lives or their choices, and when Catherine's cries grew more desperate as the labor reached its final stages, Tristan forced himself from his bed with strength he absolutely should not have possessed in his condition. Ignoring the loud protests of Dr. Graves and supported by 2 footmen who had been waiting outside his chambers, he made the slow, agonizing journey down the corridor to the birthing chamber and took his place beside his wife's bed, dismissing everyone's objections with a gesture that still carried ducal authority despite his weakness. "I am here, my love," he said, taking her hand in both of his with a grip that trembled but held firm. "I am here, and I am not leaving. Whatever happens, we face it together." His presence seemed to give Catherine renewed strength and determination. She bore down with everything she had, following Martha's instructions with fierce concentration, and just as the clock in the hall chimed midnight on November 23, 1818, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through Marlow Castle like a proclamation of life triumphant over death. Tristan Leopold Ashford the younger, heir to the Duchy of Marlow, was small but perfectly formed and healthy, with his mother's dark hair already showing in damp curls, and what would eventually prove to be his father's distinctive gray-blue eyes. When Martha placed the cleaned and swaddled infant in Tristan's arms after Catherine had been tended to, the Duke wept openly, tears streaming unchecked down his wasted face as he gazed at the miracle he had fought so hard to witness. "Hello, my son," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion too powerful for words to adequately express. "I am your father, and I love you more than I knew it was possible to love another human being. I am so sorry I cannot stay to watch you grow, to teach you all the things a father should teach his son, to guide you through the difficulties of life. But your mother will tell you about me. She will teach you to be good and kind and brave. And you will know, always know, that you are wanted desperately, that your existence is the greatest gift I have ever received, and that every moment I have with you is precious beyond all measure." Catherine, exhausted but radiant with the peculiar joy of new motherhood, watched her husband hold their child with a fierce mixture of happiness and devastating sorrow. She knew with a certainty that transcended hope or denial that Tristan had been holding on specifically for this moment. He had fought death itself for months, driven purely by determination to see his child born and to hold that child at least once. Now that need had been fulfilled, and she could see in his eyes and in the terrible peace settling over his features that he had given himself permission to let go. The next 4 days proved her intuition tragically correct. Tristan remained conscious and alert long enough to witness his son's first feeding at Catherine's breast, to see her natural grace and tenderness as a mother, to dictate a final letter to young Tristan to be opened on his 21st birthday containing advice and encouragement, and the expression of a father's eternal love. But his strength was fading visibly with each passing hour, the effort of those hours in the birthing chamber having depleted reserves he simply did not possess. On November 27th, with gray dawn light just beginning to paint the eastern sky, and Catherine lying beside him in the great bed with their 4-day-old son sleeping peacefully in a cradle positioned within reach, Tristan Leopold Ashford took his final breaths with remarkable calm. "Thank you," he whispered, his hand impossibly weak in Catherine's, his voice barely audible over the wet rattle of his breathing. "Thank you for loving me when I had nothing to offer you but hardship. Thank you for our son. Thank you for showing me what life could be in my final months. I am not afraid, Catherine. I am only grateful, so deeply, profoundly grateful for every moment we had together." "I love you," Catherine said through tears that streamed down her face unchecked, her voice steady despite her breaking heart. "I will love you until I draw my own last breath and beyond. And I will ensure our son knows his father was the best man I ever encountered, the only man who truly saw me and valued me for who I am." Tristan smiled then, a real smile despite the pain, despite the blood on his lips, despite the rattle in his chest that signaled the very end approaching. "You were the making of me, Catherine Eloise. Remember that always. Not duke, not title, not duty or bloodline or any of the things society values. You, loving you, being loved by you." That was when I finally became who I was always meant to be. That was when my life finally had meaning beyond performance. His eyes closed then, his breathing growing shallow and irregular, the spaces between breaths stretching longer. And as the first full light of dawn broke through the windows, Tristan Leopold Ashford, Duke of Marlow, died peacefully in his wife's arms with his newborn son sleeping nearby, having lived 5 months longer than any physician had predicted possible, and having found in his final months more genuine happiness and authentic connection than all his previous years of dutiful existence combined. The funeral 10 days later was a grand affair, attended by nobility from across England, all of them dressed in black and offering condolences while whispering behind their fans about the scandal of the Duke who had married his servant and the infant heir, whose legitimacy some quietly questioned despite the legal ceremony and multiple witnesses. Vincent played the role of grieving cousin with practiced skill while his eyes calculated his next moves, confident that a young widow of common birth with an infant would prove easy to manipulate or sideline once appropriate time had passed. But those who believed Catherine Eloise Ashford would prove weak or compliant or easily controlled had fundamentally misunderstood who she was and what she had become through love and loss and the crucible of impossible circumstances. Tristan's death did not break her as Vincent had hoped and predicted. Instead, it forged her into something stronger, more determined, more capable than even she had imagined possible. The jointure Tristan had settled on her proved legally unbreakable despite Vincent's best efforts and the expensive solicitors he hired from London. Catherine had income and legal rights that could not be challenged without risking the scandal of suing a widow with an infant heir, an action that would make Vincent look grasping and heartless to the very society whose approval he desperately sought. The proclamation declaring young Tristan as rightful heir to the duchy had been signed by Tristan himself, witnessed by multiple parties including the family solicitor, and recorded in all appropriate legal documents before his death. Vincent could contest it certainly, but doing so would be expensive, time-consuming, and likely to fail given the weight of evidence and testimony. More importantly, Catherine proved to have allies she had not fully appreciated during Tristan's lifetime. Mrs. Porter stood by her steadfastly, using her decades of connections and respect within the servant community to ensure Catherine had loyal support. Many of the servants who had benefited directly from her reforms offered fierce loyalty, refusing Vincent's attempts to bribe them for information or cooperation against her. The people of Ashton Village, who had seen her kindness firsthand and appreciated the practical improvements she had implemented, viewed her as one of their own, who had risen without forgetting her roots. Even some of the local gentry, who might have been expected to side with Vincent based purely on class allegiance, found themselves charmed by the young widow who attended Sunday services with her infant son, who spoke to everyone with genuine interest rather than aristocratic condescension, and who demonstrated intelligence and capability in managing her affairs. Catherine made a strategic decision to establish herself in a smaller but still comfortable residence on the estate grounds, rather than maintaining the cold grandeur of the main castle, which held too many memories of loss. She hired a young woman named Sarah Winters from Ashton Village as a nursemaid, treating her with the same respect she wished others had shown her years ago when she first arrived at Marlow Castle, frightened and uncertain. She continued the reforms she had begun under Tristan's approval, improving conditions and wages for workers, ensuring the estate turned profit not through exploitation of laborers, but through fair dealing and practical management that benefited everyone. Vincent seethed from his residence on a lesser Ashford property, watching his expected inheritance slip further from his grasp with each month that passed. His attempts to undermine Catherine met with surprising resistance at every turn. When he tried to cut her jointure through creative legal maneuvering, Mr. Whitmore, the family solicitor, refused to participate, citing his duty to uphold Tristan's clearly expressed wishes. When he attempted to spread rumors about Catherine's fitness to serve as regent for young Tristan, Mrs. Porter and others vocally defended her character in terms so strong that the gossip died before taking root. When he suggested to other noble families that she should be encouraged to remarry and cede control of estate management to more experienced male hands, they politely but firmly indicated that the young duchess seemed perfectly capable of managing her own affairs and those of her son's inheritance. The emotional price of these protracted struggles, the frequent late-night consultations, and the sheer endurance required was immense, but it only sharpened Catherine's resolve. Young Tristan grew from helpless infant to active toddler under his mother's devoted care and guidance. At 2 years old, he was a cheerful child, with his mother's warmth and capacity for joy, and his father's curiosity about the world, darting through gardens that Catherine had transformed from the neglected spaces of Tristan's dying days into vibrant expressions of living beauty. She spoke to her son daily about his father, showing him the portrait that hung in their sitting room and reading him simplified versions of the letters Tristan had written. "Your papa loved you before he ever met you," she would say, holding the small boy on her lap while he played with the locket containing a miniature of his father. "He fought very hard to stay long enough to see you born, and every extra day we had with him was a precious gift we will treasure forever." By the time young Tristan turned 5, Catherine had become known throughout the county not as the servant who had married scandalously above her station, but as the clever, compassionate woman who had transformed the Marlow estates through progressive reforms and practical management. Tenant farmers sought her counsel on crop rotation and modern agricultural techniques. Local families requested her presence at gatherings not out of obligation, but genuine desire for her company and conversation. She sat on charity boards, advised other estate holders on progressive management practices that balanced profit with worker welfare, and became an advocate for better conditions throughout the region. Vincent made one final desperate attempt to assert control when young Tristan was 7 years old, petitioning the courts to have Catherine removed as regent on the grounds that her common birth and lack of aristocratic training made her fundamentally unsuitable to guide the heir to a duchy. The petition failed spectacularly when dozens of respectable families, several members of parliament who had known Tristan, and even a minor royal connection submitted letters supporting Catherine's continued guardianship and praising her competence, character, and the remarkable improvements she had implemented across the Marlow estates. The judge's ruling was unambiguous and delivered with unusual emotion. Catherine Eloise Ashford had proven herself more than capable of managing both the estate and her son's upbringing with wisdom, compassion, and practical intelligence. Young Tristan William Ashford would remain in his mother's care until reaching his majority at 21, at which point he would assume full control of the duchy. Vincent was explicitly ordered to cease his harassment and interference or face serious legal consequences, including possible loss of his own inheritance from the estate. On a spring morning, 5 years after Tristan's death, when Catherine was 24 years old and young, Tristan William was 7, she stood alone in the room where their love story had begun. It had been converted into a comfortable sitting room now, no longer a sick room filled with medicine bottles and the heavy scent of illness, but filled instead with light streaming through cleaned windows and shelves of books and comfortable furniture arranged to take advantage of the spectacular view of Devonshire hills rolling green into the distance. Young Tristan William, a whirlwind of childhood vitality, played in the gardens below with Thomas Winters, Sarah's son, who had become his closest companion and friend despite differences in their birth. Their laughter drifted up through the open windows on the warm spring breeze, the sound of innocent joy that both filled her heart and reminded her sharply of what Tristan had missed and would continue to miss. Catherine held the portrait of her husband that she had commissioned from sketches made during his final months by a local artist who had visited several times. The artist had somehow managed to capture not the dying man ravaged by disease, but the living person beneath. The moral clarity and humor in his eyes, the hint of gentle strength in the curve of his mouth, the dignity that had defined him even in his weakest moments. It was the Tristan she wanted their son to know, the man he truly was beyond his illness. "He asked me for 6 months with him," she whispered to the painted face, a ritual she performed whenever she needed to feel his presence. The physicians promised him until September if he was fortunate. We had 10 months total from the day I first entered his chambers, and 3 of those as husband and wife. By any reasonable measure, it was not enough time. It could never have been enough time. But we filled those months with more genuine love, more authentic connection, more meaningful conversation than most people experience in 50 years of conventional marriage. You taught me I had value beyond my station and circumstances. You gave me a son who will grow up knowing his father was a man who chose love over pride, who married for genuine affection rather than political advantage or family pressure, who spent his final months ensuring the woman he loved would be protected and provided for after his death. She touched the gilded frame gently, as she did every time she stood here. Vincent has finally stopped fighting. He lives quietly on his property and no longer interferes, having learned that I am far more stubborn and resourceful than he ever imagined possible. I pity him the poverty of his ambition. Our son is healthy and happy, and loved beyond measure. He learns quickly, asks thoughtful questions, and shows remarkable compassion for others, just as you did. The estates prosper under management that balances profit with human welfare. The people are treated fairly, and their loyalty is genuine rather than forced. I have purpose and respect, and the knowledge that I have honored your trust in me. You left me a legacy, my love. Not just our son, though he is precious beyond anything I can express. You left me the confidence to become someone I never imagined I could be. You left me knowing what real love feels like, and that knowledge has sustained me through 5 years without your physical presence, but with your influence guiding every decision I make. Young Tristan's voice drifted up from the gardens, calling excitedly for his mother to come see the unusual butterfly he and Thomas had discovered. Catherine smiled through the tears that always came during these private moments of remembrance, wiping her face and composing herself before responding. "I must now go," she said to the portrait, preparing to return to the world of the living and the son who needed her. "Our son needs me, and I will not keep him waiting even for this. But know this, Tristan Leopold Ashford, and carry it with you wherever your spirit resides. You asked me for a gift, one last impossible thing before you died. I thought at the time that I was giving you an heir, a piece of yourself to continue after you were gone, a child to carry your bloodline forward. But the truth, which I understand more clearly with each passing year, is that you gave me far more than I gave you. You gave me a kingdom I never imagined, not of stone and titles and social position, but of purpose and love and a son who carries forward your goodness and gentle strength. That is the real legacy, my dearest love. Not the duchy, not the wealth, not the title or the estates, but the love that transformed both of us completely and continues to transform this corner of England, where a servant girl became a duke's wife and proved that nobility has nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character and choices. She set down the portrait carefully, running her fingers one last time over the painted features she had memorized through touch and sight. Then she turned toward the door, toward the sound of children's laughter in the garden, toward the life she had built from grief and love, and the memory of a dying man who had seen her worth when the entire world insisted she had none. Vincent Ashford could rot in his bitterness and unfulfilled ambitions. Society could continue to whisper behind their fans about the scandal and impropriety of it all. None of it mattered anymore, if it ever truly had. Catherine Eloise Ashford, commoner by birth but duchess in every way that mattered, had won something far more valuable than social approval or acceptance into aristocratic circles. She had won a love that transcended death itself, a son who would carry his father's best qualities forward into the next generation, and proof that sometimes the greatest legacies are built not in lifetimes, but in months, when two people dare to love honestly despite impossible odds and a world determined to tell them such love cannot and should not exist. Tristan had asked for 6 months. Through their love and their choices and their courage to defy convention, he had been given 10. And Catherine, through those 10 precious months, had been given eternity. An eternity of knowing she was loved completely. An eternity of memories to sustain her through the decades ahead. An eternity expressed in the face of their son, who would grow up knowing that love, real love, was worth any sacrifice and could overcome any barrier that society or circumstance placed in its path. She dried her tears, straightened her dress, and went to join her son in the garden where spring sunshine painted everything gold and the future stretched before them, full of possibility born from impossible love.